to Off the Page, the show where we talk with Colorado authors to get the story behind the story. I'm Stacy McKenzie, a librarian here at Mamie Dowd Eisenhower Public Library in Broomfield. And today we are celebrating the holidays with our author, William Gates Lawrence. I'm gonna call you Bill.
Please.
And his wonderful book, The Very Special Wreath. It's a very special book about a very special wreath. Bill, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for asking me. I'm delighted to be here.
So happy to have you. Before we talk about the book, tell me a little bit about yourself, about what exciting things you've done in your past. I know there are some.
I think probably the most exciting thing I did was to work as counsel. I'm an attorney, and I worked as counsel to the House of Representatives. Headed a couple of committees and subcommittees, so that was a wonderful time for me.
Yeah, that's so exciting. Lots of interesting things happened, I'm sure. And now you are an author. Is this your first book?
It's my first book. I call it the first thing I ever had to read and hope people liked it. Because the stuff I used to write on the Hill, I didn't care if people liked it or not. I mean, it was technical legal stuff.
Yeah, very different from this wonderful book. Okay, I can't wait to talk about the book, but I want to ask you one more thing that's a really special, interesting thing where we can talk to our audience about. You also have another passion, and that's talking to groups about organ and tissue donation.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about what you talk about when you go talk to groups about this and why it's so special to you.
Well, it's special to me because I'm an organ recipient. I had an emergency liver transplant and it saved my life. This was 28 years ago. But following an event like that, you tend to want to learn about what you're now involved in and what happened to you. I didn't even know I was getting a transplant. So I ended up working for a period of time for the United Network for Organ Sharing, which is the federal contractor who maintains the waiting list. If you're listed for an organ, you're on that list there, and they make policy and so forth, and do a lot of education. So I feel I benefited greatly from having a good, solid organ and tissue program in this country. And I just want people to have a chance to think about it and hope that they would become an organ donor as well. The state of Colorado is very lucky to have Donor Alliance, which is the organ procurement organization for Colorado and parts of Wyoming. They do a great job. I'm on their advisory board, and so I would just encourage anyone who is inclined to be an organ donor, tell your family about it, sign an organ donor card.
That's wonderful. I just love that you have that. And 28 years ago, so what a wonderful thing to talk about and to lend your passions to.
Thank you.
So now the book, The Very Special Wreath, so different than all of that dry political writing and stuff like that.
Oh, yes.
So different than sort of organ donation, the very serious topic of that. What brought you to write a wonderful children's book about a Christmas wreath? Well,
like every parent, I've read a lot of books to my kids, including Christmas books, and I found that most of them were sort of Hollywood, Walt Disney, Jolly Santa, flying reindeer, you know, lots of presents type books, and they're entertaining. I like Santa too. But I wanted a book that would speak to the spirit of charity at Christmas, a little more Dickens maybe than Disney, but so I wrote a book about a little girl and her experiences with helping people in need at Christmas time. And the book follows her as she learns about the value of charity.
Yeah, the value of charity. And it has a nice progression through the book where we get to see her learn these in increments and little along the way, and a wonderful, happy, sweet ending.
It does.
We don't want to give too much away.
No, but the little girl buys a very ornate wreath for her mother for the Christmas present, and is carrying it home from the florist where she bought it, and encounters those who actually are in need in the holiday season, as opposed to the ones who are festive and joyful and wrapping presents. And I mean, ranged from a mouse who was starving in a recent snow, couldn't find food, to a little boy who had made a wreath for his mother, but it was made from weeds out behind the school, and he was very unhappy about it, and knew that he just knew his mother would hate it. And the little girl said to herself, his mother wouldn't hate it, he made it. But he thinks that she would, so he's sad at Christmas. And so she takes ornamentation from her wreath and puts it on his, and he's thrilled and happy. And she's learning all the while that she feels good too, that even though she's giving things away, she's getting that feeling back. And the book progresses through that until she gets home and the wreath is pretty much tattered. And she realizes what she's done. She's given so much of it away, and she has to explain to her mother what happened. So, and the rest you can read in the book.
And we talked a little bit before the taping about the inspiration for this story. And so we're going to try not to get too teary.
Well, it's a
share with us.
It's a sentimental thing for me. My wife and I were in New York City years ago with our daughter when she was probably 10 or 12. And she was into show music and Broadway musicals. And so we took her to a musical and she loved it. And we ended up in the stage door delicatessen where they serve enormous sandwiches. And my daughter could only eat half of hers, so they wrapped up the other half for her. And as we walked out of the deli onto the streets of New York, sitting on the curb right in front of us was an old homeless guy, just weathered and kind of windblown. And my daughter just walked up to him and said, "Here, I think you need this more than I do."
Yeah.
And he was happy about it. He was thrilled about that.
Yeah.
And she said, "I put mustard on it. I hope that's okay." And he said, "Honey, trust me, it's fine." But she didn't ask me, "Daddy, could I do this? Should I do this?" It was just her personal feelings that he was in need and she had something he could use. And that's, of course, the core sentiment in the book.
Yeah. Bill, what really made this book for me, besides the wonderful story, are the illustrations, how well they fit with the book. Where did you get these illustrations? Tell me about them.
Well, every author has to go through a process when he or she has written a book to get illustrations done by someone whose style is consistent with the story. They have to be complementary. In this book, it would be you couldn't have the Rudolph type art. You needed something else. I remembered the old Madeline series when I was reading to my daughter, and that was set in France, and the illustrator was French, and I liked that style. So I searched and searched for someone who could do this book, and actually the author who I ended up, the illustrator I ended up using is in Kiev, Ukraine, and it's obviously European style art instead of Hollywood style art, but it fits the story.
Yes, so much so.
Yeah.
It's just, it's really beautiful. It's realistic to a point, and I just think it does fit your story. And so you met them and you worked with them, and how was that? How did you communicate if you didn't meet them?
It was a real challenge, especially for me as a first-time author. I introduced myself to him by internet, obviously. I mean, to this day, I've never met him. And he sent me some sample illustrations. I had seen on the internet some of his work. It wasn't this type, but it was a style that I liked. And so I asked him to send me a couple of sample illustrations, and found that he was very intuitive. And I would tell him what the picture needed to be, what the illustration needed to be, and he'd put it together and send it to me. And I'd send it back and I'd say, "No, actually the little girl should be on the right side here," and no problem, and the next day I'd have it back. And it rarely took more than 3 or 4 exchanges to get it just right. I mean, it was such a wonderful experience for me because, as I said, he was so intuitive and was able to read what I wanted.
And a good connection to make the final product. Would you show us a couple of the illustrations?
Oh, I'd love to.
Tell us about them.
Yeah. The story is set in a village, and so a lot of the illustrations are, this is the village flower shop where the little girl went in with her mother, and her mother said, "Oh, what a beautiful wreath that is. Oh, it's just perfect." And the little girl, who had been stumped for a present for her mother, mothers are the hardest thing to buy for, said that wreath would be the perfect gift for me to get. And later in the day, she slipped back to the florist and bought it. But this was illustrative of that. Let's see, I have a couple marked here. This I alluded to earlier. It's the little boy with his little homemade wreath and the little girl looking at it and saying, I could make his wreath look pretty so that he'd love it. So this is the encounter between them. I like these 2 illustrations. They were actually the first 2 that I got from the illustrator, and because this is where the story actually begins. The little girl is in the florist shop picking up the wreath, and as she exits the florist shop, encounters the mouse, whose mouse hole had been obscured, and so the little girl says, "There are a bunch of acorns and so forth on my wreath. He needs them more than I do." One of the creatures that the little girl feels sorry for is a bird whose nest had been destroyed in the snowstorm the night before and was lying smashed on the ground, and because of the snow, the bird couldn't find the makings for a new nest. So the little girl was motivated to take some of the fresh, beautiful spruce and pine out of her wreath and very quietly lay it on the ground so that the bird could find something to build a new nest with. In this next illustration in the book, the bird has come down to the ground and taken the pine boughs up and built a little nest, and there's even an acorn right in front. So the little girl thinks it looks like a wreath kind of for the little bird, but a lot of people find this their favorite illustration in the book. But yeah, obviously not Disney art.
Yes, no, but just gorgeous and fits with the story. That's what's so nice is the blending. That's when you know you've got something really magical. And we mentioned this is a children's book. Tell me about what the best audience for this book might be, maybe an age range?
Yeah, Barnes & Noble pegged this at between 5 and 10 years old. I think actually that you could read it to a 4-year-old, for example, and even though he or she might be unable to read along with you, because of the way the illustrations tell the story, just as the text underneath is telling the story, they could follow it. And a 4-year-old can pick up plenty in terms of Christmas. And so I'd say probably 4 to 10.
Okay.
But I've also found from comments I've gotten from readers that the parents like the book for their own reasons as much as the child does, because the parents get to read a book that actually says something that the parents would like to say to their child, and they can say it through a book and reinforce it perhaps through the book.
Yeah.
So yeah, I get parents telling me that one said, my child has a bunch of books, and every Christmas we drag them out, and some of them I go, oh, that's a good one, and some of them I go, oh, not that again. So I wanted this to be one of the ones that would be a good one, that a parent would enjoy reading to the child.
And it's beautiful and it's different, as we mentioned, so it'd be fun to have a Christmas tradition, and this is the book that you read each year under the Christmas tree. So I just love that idea. And the message in the book, that is, of course, universal. But what would you sum up as the message you want people to take away from the book?
I think the message is that at some point, it's important for all of us to become aware of certain valuable social facts. one is charity, of course. And the best way to introduce that to a child is not to say, give your allowance to X, Y, Z charity, but rather to illustrate to the child why it's important to do this and how it feels to do this and what you can do for other people and how that makes you feel in return. And I chose to do it through a story that illustrates that. I mean, parents can choose how they want to address things with their kids, but for me, this was the way.
And I like how it's just to look for those natural instincts in children and plant the seed, just like your little girl. It was just seemed so natural for her to just go give that to someone who needed it. So beautiful.
Right, yeah. Hopefully you're working with a receptive kid who thinks about things like this.
Yeah. So. Let's talk about reaction to the book. When you mentioned some parents have given you a little feedback, what kind of reactions have you gotten to the book?
Well, it's been terrific, actually. I didn't really know what to expect because, as you said, this is my first foray into this kind of writing. But everybody who's rated it on Amazon, for example, has rated it at 5 stars, which is good. And nobody's expressed any disappointment with it, so I'm happy about that. I mentioned Barnes & Noble there, very supportive, and have picked the book up, which for a first-time author is kind of thrilling. To have a nationwide chain actually say your book is good enough that we're going to put it on our website.
For sure.
And some of the local stores are even carrying it, the Barnes & Nobles.
Yeah, that's wonderful to get picked up by a big chain like that. That's marvelous.
Well, I'm in the Boulder Bookstore too, up on Pearl Street. And I don't know if everyone watching this will know that, but it's a very old, established bookstore in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm proud to be there.
You should be, because it's not big. They don't have all the books.
No,
so
they have a lot of books.
They have a lot of books, but they're picky with who they have in there.
Yes.
So that's great feedback right there. Marvelous. So let's talk about your process of writing the book. We talked a little bit earlier also, and you said writing the book was the easy part. What did you mean by that?
I had this story in not as a comprehensive story, but the elements of this story in my head for years. And after retiring, I wanted to write something, and it just seemed so natural to do this. And because I was already familiar with what I wanted the story to be, it was, I don't want to say easy because it was work, but it didn't take long to get it laid out, and then a couple of editing sessions. That didn't take so long, but what took so long and what I learned as a first-time author was this is a big business. Producing a book does not consist of writing it. It consists of writing it, getting it illustrated, getting it through text editing, getting it through layout editing, and getting to a printer and getting all of that done. And I self-published this. So I sort of had to do that too. And I mean, it was a real process, and still is a learning experience for me.
So now that you know that, what type of advice would you give for an aspiring writer?
I get asked that sometimes. I have a personal belief that there's a book in everybody. I've spoken to a lot of people now about this book, and almost all of them say, you know, I wrote a book one time, it's in a dresser drawer back home, or I'd love to write a book about this. You know, you wrote that, that's not, but I'd write this. And I always say, well, why don't you do that? And they're daunted. And they ought to be daunted because as I just said, it's not all that easy, but it's doable. And there are a lot of people around who want to help you. And so the advice I would give, though, if I were sitting down again to do this book, having said all that, would be these books have certain technical requirements. And of course, I didn't know any of this when I sat down. So I wrote the story out and went to the layout editor, who said, well, you're going to have 32 pages to tell this story, and half of each page is going to be an illustration. So actually you have about 16 pages to tell the story. So your book right now is too long. And so I had to go back and adjust and make it fit the space you have. I mean, you're an artist, but you're a mechanic too, in a sense. Getting the text broken up so that it would match the illustration on each page is next. None of this is really particularly hard, but you have to think about it a lot. So there are certain technical aspects. I wouldn't say, these aren't laws, these are just conventions.
Right.
And so I would tell someone, write what you want to write.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have certain conventions applied to what you've written, and you'll have to be edited, and don't be, defensive about that, because there are people who know a lot more than you do, and just proceed that way with the book. But at every stage, there are people who know a lot more than you.
Yeah.
So seek out those people and listen to them. And my next book will be a lot easier than this one, just in terms of producing it.
Oh, let's talk about this next book. That's always a question I like to know. I'm so happy you're thinking about another book. Is it going to be another children's book?
Yeah, I like kids' books.
That's wonderful.
I loved reading them to my kids, and I appreciated the good ones. But this wouldn't be a Christmas book. Probably a little boy adventure involving ranches and horses and stuff like that, and bad guys and train robberies, and so I have sort of the track of it done, but I'm nowhere near sitting down to write it.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful idea. Totally different.
Yes.
Not a holiday, and a little boy with adventures.
Right.
That sounds fabulous. So you talked about how this book you found the right people to help you, and with your next book you're even better. I know that you have a great organization that you work with to find some of these great people.
Yes.
SEPA. Tell me about SEPA, and tell me about what they've done for you and how they've helped you.
SEPA is CIPA, the Colorado Independent Publishers Association, and it's an association that brings together writers, book producers, book publicists, the whole group that you need to put a book together. And I found them just a terrific help. I asked a lot of questions, and no one ever said, "Don't bother me, kid."
Yeah.
They'd sit down and talk to you about whatever you had questions about. And it was helpful, obviously, substantively, but it was reassuring to know that you had that backup and you weren't going to get stuck somewhere and not know what to do.
Yeah.
So, in fact, you and I met at a SEPA meeting.
We did. I love to go there.
It was the first time I had ever held my book up in front of live people to talk about it. And so I wasn't particularly nervous, though, because these are all people who do the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's a good place to go to be in a book producing environment.
That's wonderful.
I recommend SEPA to any new author, especially.
Yes, that's where I go and scout a lot of my new authors, and it's just a world of options for me. And they do have so many options for editors and help with illustrations and your book covers and all that great stuff.
Right.
So
Right.
I'm glad you found them so that you could be here today, so I could have met you. As kind of a final question for you, Bill, I'd like to ask you specifically about when writing for children. What advice would you give for someone not just writing, but writing for children?
I tried to think the way an 8-year-old little girl would think. And of course, I had an 8-year-old little girl,
Yes.
and so some insight into that. But I think it's important to, I think several things are important.
Yes.
I think one, it's important to organize your thoughts about the book and even your first cut through the book around the fact that this is going to be read by impressionable young kids, probably their parent will be reading it to them, but
Yeah.
they're the target. And so try to keep both the storyline and the rest of the book production, the illustrations and so forth, on that level. And I don't mean talk down to them.
Right.
I mean talk so that they will follow and get what you're having to say, which is the second issue that I was going to mention. For me, personally, just to sit down and write a book that's entertaining, I know kids like to have those read, especially at the holidays, but to me, I wanted to say something in the book that would be useful. I mean, and so that's what I tried to do here. Not make it a drudge. I mean, this is not, I mentioned Dickens before. This is not, you know, a Christmas Carol.
Right,
it's
right.
not. It's not that dark, but
Yeah.
but it's sort of, it talks about social issues a little bit, and walks a little girl through her interpretation of them and her reaction to them.
Yeah, really getting into that mindset, but not dumbing it down, not talking down.
Yeah, don't dumb it down.
Don't dumb it down. They don't need that, especially
Well,
kids
and they'll
these
know
days.
that you dumbed it down.
They'll know.
So you know,
They will.
they may be kids,
completely-
but they know what they're doing.
Well, Bill, you have a website that people can visit.
I do.
To contact you about anything, contact you about visits, about maybe doing some readings of the book.
I love to do readings of the book to grade school classes and so forth.
Yeah.
It's almost, this is going to sound kind of corny, but it's almost new to me every time I do it.
Yeah.
So that's good. But the website is theveryspecialwreath.com.
Perfect.
And
You
yeah,
can remember that.
yeah.
Wonderful. I can't wait to hear more about you reading this book, to hear about more of your feedback since you're so new at this. It's so exciting to see. Such a great project. And I can't wait to hear about your next book with a little boy on big adventures.
Well, don't hold your breath.
I won't hold my breath.
I've got a long way to go with this one.
But every time
but I know what the book will be, and that helps.
Every time I see you, I'm going to ask you about it. How are we doing? on the
Okay.
book? Thanks again, Bill, for being on the show.
Thank
It was a
you,
pleasure.
Stacey.
You
Thank
bet.
you for inviting me.
I'd like to thank my author today on the show, William Gates Lawrence, and his wonderful book, The Very Special Wreath. Check your library for books that we've talked about on today's show, and join us for more on Off the Page.